What happens when a man silently carries power only to be treated like a threat because of the color of his skin? What if the calmest voice in the cabin was the one everyone ignored, Darian Wells, a high-ranking FAA executive, boarded Flight 482 expecting routine? But instead of professional courtesy, he was met with suspicion, whispered walkie-talkie exchanges, and a growing storm in Zone 1. They didn't see the title. They didn't see the decades of service. They saw something else and they reacted. But Darian didn't shout. He didn't fight. He sat. And when he finally spoke, the entire nation leaned in to listen. How did one quiet moment aboard a plane ignite a nationwide reckoning across the skies? And what happens when dignity challenges power without ever raising its voice? This is not just a story about race. It's a story about visibility, about justice, about who gets to belong. Stay with us. Hit like, share, and subscribe to support stories that matter, and let's begin the flight that changed everything. The hum of the terminal at Gate 37B wasn't particularly loud, but it had a kind of subdued chaos that comes before long flights. People stood in clusters with coffee cups, rolling suitcases clicking behind them, voices low but restless. Most travelers had their heads down, distracted by phones, gate monitors, or conversations that barely filled the silence. A boarding announcement came through the overhead system. First class, Flight 482 to New York City. Now boarding. There was the usual shuffle of movement. A man in a gray fleece vest adjusted his backpack straps. A young woman clutched a child's blanket. A suited businessman scanned his boarding pass and didn't look up once. Then came a man who moved differently, not quickly, not slowly, but with a kind of deliberate grace that made the air shift slightly around him. Darian Wells didn't carry much, just a slim black leather bag slung over one shoulder and the quiet air of someone who had learned long ago how to walk into spaces without apologizing for being there. He wore a navy-tailored blazer over a muted charcoal shirt, slacks pressed without a wrinkle. His beard was neatly trimmed, flecked with silver at the edges. His shoes were polished but worn in the way that suggested long walks in quiet airports. He didn't make eye contact with the gate agent, but gave her a small, respectful nod. She glanced at his boarding pass, hesitated for just a second longer than she should have, then forced a smile. "Enjoy your flight, sir." Darian nodded once and stepped onto the jet bridge inside the aircraft. The first-class cabin was softly lit, almost warm in tone. The leather seats gleamed faintly under overhead lights. Folded linens waited atop polished tray tables. The air had that sterile, recycled scent that all planes shared. But in first class, it smelled faintly more expensive. Seat 2A. He'd chosen the window seat, quietest place, least eye contact. He preferred to fly without conversation. Darian placed his bag gently beneath the seat ahead of him, then lowered himself into the chair. He moved like someone who didn't want to draw attention, but never avoided it either. Across the aisle in 2B, a man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair and a Bluetooth headset already in one ear, gave Darian a brief once-over. His gaze lingered a little too long on Darian's skin before turning away as if the glance had been accidental. It hadn't. Darian noticed, but didn't flinch. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, slid his phone into the seat pocket, and closed his eyes. Just for a moment. He'd taken 100 flights like this. Quiet, efficient, uneventful. But something about today felt off. He couldn't name it. but it sat just beneath his ribs like a slow pressure. He wasn't imagining it, not entirely. He opened his eyes again when he heard the subtle rhythm of firm footsteps. A flight attendant had entered the cabin, moving with textbook posture and tightly coiled efficiency. Her uniform was crisp, deep maroon with silver piping. Her blonde hair was twisted into a perfect bun. Her name tag read Lena Brody. She stopped beside his seat. "Excuse me, sir," she said with a practiced smile, not quite meeting his eyes. "May I see your boarding pass?" There was no warmth in her tone, but it wasn't openly hostile either, just clipped, as though this was standard protocol. Darian looked at her calmly. "I'm in 2A, he said simply. She didn't move. "We've had a few irregularities recently," Lena added. "We're asking to verify seating in the first-class cabin." Darian gave her a long, silent look. Then, with deliberate ease, he retrieved his boarding pass from the side pocket and handed it to her. She didn't take it, not immediately. Instead, her hand hovered, uncertain, as if the paper itself might be counterfeit. Finally, she took it. Her eyes flicked to the seat number. 2A. Her lips tightened. "Thank you. I'll confirm this with the manifest." She turned without waiting for a response. From the galley, another attendant peeked out, a younger woman with auburn hair and sharp eyeliner, Jenna Myers, by her name tag. She exchanged a look with Lena, unreadable to anyone who hadn't worked with flight crews before. Then a third attendant stepped out, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, and clearly senior. His name tag read Colin Rourke. He leaned on the entryway with a casual smirk, but his eyes were anything but relaxed. "What's going on?" he asked, voice low. "This gentleman is sitting in 2A, just verifying the ticket." Lena replied. Colin looked Darian over with a glance that was quick but thorough. "We've had issues with mistaken upgrades," he said, like it was a joke. Jenna gave a little chuckle. It didn't reach her eyes. Darian didn't move. His hands rested in his lap, his phone still untouched in the seat pocket. The cabin had begun to quiet. A few passengers glanced up from behind their tablets and books. He'd felt this kind of quiet before. It was the kind of silence that didn't need volume to be loud, and it always came just before someone overplayed their role. Lena returned a moment later. Behind her, a fourth crew member trailed a younger Asian man with a scanning device in hand. His name tag read Noah Tran. Lena said nothing to Darian, only handed the boarding pass to Noah. He scanned it. The scanner blinked, then beeped twice. No match found. Noah frowned. "That's weird. He's not showing in the first-class roster." Lena folded her arms. "Sir," she said again, voice gaining edge, "I'm going to ask you to step out of the seat until we sort this out." Darian didn't answer immediately. He breathed in, held it, then opened his eyes fully and spoke, calm as ever. "No." A ripple moved through the cabin. Someone a few rows behind leaned forward slightly. Lena blinked. "Excuse me, I have a valid ticket. I'm not moving." Noah shifted his weight. "Maybe I should call it in. There could be a sync issue." Colin stepped in closer, arms crossed. "It's a simple request," he said. "You can wait in the galley until we figure it out." Darian's gaze was even. "I'll wait right here." His tone wasn't challenging. It wasn't loud, but it held like stone. And in that moment, the mood changed. Not just for the crew, for everyone in that cabin. Someone whispered from row 3 just loud enough to hear, "He's about to own this whole plane." Darian didn't look at them. He didn't look at anyone. He reached slowly into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and placed it gently on the tray table in front of him. The screen lit up, and in the background, all 4 crew radios lit up at once. Lena Brody stood frozen for just a breath. Her eyes narrowed as Darian Wells slowly laid his phone face up on the tray table. She hadn't expected that. Not the quiet defiance, not the control. She had expected discomfort, maybe awkwardness, an apology, anything but composure. But this man, he hadn't raised his voice once, and now the cabin was watching, behind her. Jenna Myers shifted uneasily, glancing down the aisle. A passenger in row 4 tilted his phone slightly, recording. Micah Thompson, a lanky teenager traveling alone to visit his aunt in Manhattan, squinted into the camera lens and muttered under his breath, "I think this is about to blow up." Back in 2A, Darian adjusted his cuffs. "Sir," Lena repeated, this time more firmly. "Recording crew members without consent is a violation of federal aviation policy." She said it like a warning, but her voice had a tremor underneath. It was slight, but Darian heard it. He said nothing, because he didn't need to. Colin Rourke pressed the button on his shoulder radio. Zone 1. He spoke into the mic. Passenger in seat 2, Alpha refusing to comply. Possible unauthorized video recording. Request backup for escalation. The radio crackled with static. "Copy. Zone 1. A voice replied, "Security en route to gate." Jenna stepped closer. Her arms were crossed now. "Not for comfort, for control. I'm going to need you to hand over your phone, sir," she said. Noah Tran hovered behind them, still holding the scanner, uncertainty written all over his face. Darian didn't move. He didn't reach for the phone. He didn't even look at them. His eyes rested on the oval window to his left, watching the edge of the jet bridge as the sunlight shifted ever so slightly across the wing. Inside, his heart beat steady, but deeper still, in a place no scanner could detect. Something heavier stirred. The old ache, the one that came not from being doubted, but from expecting it, from knowing that no matter the title, the credentials, or the track record, there would always be someone whose eyes didn't see who you were, only who they assumed you couldn't be. He could hear his father's voice echo from years ago. "You don't get to flinch. You stand tall even when they measure you wrong." Still, it wore on a man. Lena was speaking again. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll be forced to remove you from the aircraft." Darian slowly turned his gaze back toward her. Not angry, not confrontational, just, "Still, my name is Darian Wells. I'm in seat 2A. You scanned my boarding pass." "That should be enough," Jenna replied. "But it didn't register in our manifest. The system says you're not listed in first class." He looked at Noah, the youngest of the 4. "Does your system ever fail?" he asked calmly. Noah hesitated. "It can happen," he admitted, voice quiet. "Sometimes syncing issues with pre-boarding updates." Colin shot him a look. "Doesn't matter. If he's not showing up, we can't confirm his seat. Then maybe check again." Darian replied. Lena's jaw tensed. She took a small step forward, lowering her voice. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you're making this harder than it has to be." There it was, that phrase. Darian had heard it so many times in his life, at airports, at boardroom doors, at hotel counters, at security checkpoints. Each time, it carried the same weight. The implication that his calm was confrontation, that his presence was provocation, that his refusal to shrink somehow equaled aggression. You're making this harder than it has to be. What it really meant was, stop reminding me I might be wrong. He leaned forward slightly, hands resting on his knees, and said just above a whisper, I haven't moved, I haven't raised my voice, I haven't broken a single rule. Why are you escalating? Jenna didn't answer. Colin folded his arms tighter. The silence stretched. Then the curtain at the front of the cabin shifted. Two figures stepped through. The first was a tall man in a black sport coat with a security lanyard around his neck. His badge read, A. Delaney Skylark Terminal Supervisor. A woman followed closely, wearing a dark gray vest with Skylark security insignia. Her eyes moved sharply between the flight crew and Darian. Delaney looked at Lena. What's the issue? Lena pointed toward 2A. Passenger, not listed in first class, refused to move, refusing to stop recording. The woman scanned Darian with an even gaze. Name Darian Wells. He answered clearly. She looked at Noah. Scanner. Noah held it up. Didn't match. Still no result. Darian slowly reached into his inside jacket pocket. Everyone stiffened. Lena took a step back. Jenna's hand hovered near her radio again, but Darian's movements were smooth, measured. He pulled out a slim black wallet, opened it slowly, and offered his driver's license and a secondary badge. The security woman took them. She paused at the second item. It bore a minimalist silver seal, Federal Aviation Administration Field Oversight Division. Her face changed. So did Delaney's. Is this legitimate? Delaney asked quietly. The woman pulled out her device and scanned the barcode on the back of the badge. It chirped, then blinked green. Confirmed, she said. It's active. Lena looked like she'd just stepped off a cliff. That doesn't mean he was assigned first class, she said quickly. Actually, the woman said, turning her screen toward Lena, Skylark's manifest just updated. Mr. Wells is listed under a protected FAA category. Discrete status. Delaney swallowed. Colin muttered something under his breath. From behind them, a new voice cut through the tension. A sharp, clear voice piped in from the aircraft's overhead speaker. Flight 482 crew. This is Central Operation. Please pause all further interaction with Passenger 2A. Federal Oversight Command has been notified and is coordinating. The entire cabin went still. Jenna stared up at the speaker. Lena's arms dropped to her sides. Colin took a step back. Micah, in row 4, whispered into his phone. Yo, he's not just a passenger. He's FAA. He's the guy. Darian didn't move. His phone still lay on the tray table, face up, screen locked, camera off. He didn't need footage. He never did. He just needed time, because the truth had its own clock, and right now it was ticking loudly. Passengers began murmuring, not hostile, not mocking. This time, it sounded like recognition. The energy in the cabin shifted from control to caution. Lena stepped away from the row and back toward the galley. She leaned against the wall, her mouth slightly open, breathing just a little too fast. No one spoke to her. No one needed to. Colin stood beside her, jaw tight, his smirk gone. Jenna tried to focus on the tablet in her hand, but her fingers trembled. Noah simply looked down at the scanner and quietly turned it off. Back in 2A. Darian Wells reached forward and flipped his phone screen down again. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The storm had already started. He didn't need to chase it. He just needed to wait. Darian Wells sat quietly in his seat, eyes closed, his hands resting loosely in his lap. The cabin air had grown heavy, as if something unspoken clung to the ceiling panels and whispered between the vents. Outside, the jet bridge remained connected. Inside, nothing moved except for the flicker of screens and the faint hum of the aircraft systems waiting for clearance. But the energy inside first class was shifting. It started in small ways. The way Lena Brody gripped the edge of the galley counter. The way Colin Rourke stood like a statue near the curtain, one hand tapping his fingers against his elbow. The way Jenna Myers didn't make eye contact with a single passenger. Noah Tran had taken a step back from the scanner and was now pacing slowly by the jump seat, reading something off a crew tablet, his brows knit closer together with every update. Passengers had stopped pretending not to watch. They didn't whisper anymore. They stared. Most didn't know who Darian was, but they felt something was wrong, something bigger than just a seat dispute. Micah Thompson, now with over 1,000 viewers on his live stream, whispered to the camera again, "I think he works for the FAA. They just said something about Central Command." His phone buzzed. Comments flooded in. "Don't stop recording. Zoom in on the crew. Dude's a legend already. Is this the Mercer guy?" Or someone else Micah didn't answer. He just steadied his phone and kept recording. Lena finally moved. She stepped out of the galley and walked down the aisle, her posture still upright, but the tightness in her shoulders betrayed her. She walked past Darian without speaking, pretending to check overhead bins, but she glanced at him twice, her lips parting slightly, unsure whether to speak again or remain silent. She did neither. She disappeared back into the galley. Jenna followed, holding her phone loosely by her side. Colin muttered, "We're screwed," then cursed softly under his breath. Noah looked up from his tablet. "Should we just reset the manifest?" Lena looked at him, eyes wide. "And admit fault I think we already did," Jenna whispered. Just then, the curtain between first class and the front galley moved again. This time, it wasn't a flight attendant. It was a man in a dark suit. No airline badge, but a thin earpiece and the kind of expression that made people stand up straighter even before he spoke. He was flanked by a younger woman in a tailored black jacket, her ID tag clipped to her waist. The man spoke in a calm, even tone. "Please identify the passenger in seat 2A. Lena stepped forward. "That's him," she said too quickly. "That's the one the scanners flagged. He wasn't on the manifest. We followed protocol." The man ignored her tone and turned to Darian. "Name, please." Darian looked up, unhurried. Darian Wells. The woman beside the suited man lifted a tablet and typed quickly. She nodded to her colleague. Confirmed. FAA registered. Executive access clearance. Elevated security tier. Lena's mouth fell slightly open. Jenna took a small step back. Colin stopped tapping his elbow. The man nodded once. "Mr. Wells, we apologize for the disruption. FAA internal flagged this boarding delay. We've confirmed your clearance with central oversight. You are fully authorized to be here." Darian inclined his head slightly, offering a small, unreadable smile. "Thank you." The suited man turned back to Lena. "Jenna, Colin, and Noah. Skylark Operations has issued a system override. All crew communications are being logged. You are now under observational protocol until further notice." Lena's face drained of color. "Wait, what does that mean?" "It means," the woman replied, Everything from this point forward is being evaluated for compliance, escalation, and bias response accuracy. Bias, Colin barked. No one said anything about race. You didn't have to, the woman said coolly. The suited man turned back toward the front of the cabin, but not before adding one final line. This matter has been elevated. Continue operations as usual. Mr. Wells will remain undisturbed. Then they were gone, slipping past the curtain as swiftly as they had come. For a moment, it was quiet. Then someone clapped, just once, then again. Scattered applause broke out across the first-class cabin. Not loud, not sarcastic, just acknowledging. Lena stood in the galley, eyes wide, arms stiff at her sides. Jenna slowly reached for her phone. Colin stared at the floor. Noah opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again, back in his seat. Darian didn't acknowledge the applause. He didn't nod, didn't shift. He simply breathed in and out, his body still composed, but his mind quietly on fire. He thought of the meetings he'd been in over the past 6 months, of the stories that never made headlines, of the messages buried in complaint logs from passengers who didn't have credentials or protection, and he thought of his mother's voice, soft but sharp, years ago in their kitchen. You don't carry silence because you have nothing to say. You carry it because you know when to let them speak first. That silence now filled the cabin like fog. Micah lowered his phone slightly. Now, with 6,000 viewers, they're backing down, he whispered. You guys seeing this FAA just walked in and the whole crew shut up. He looked at Darian, and for the first time, Darian looked back. Not long, not with drama, just one glance that said, I see you. Micah held up his hand, a subtle half-salute, a quiet thank you. Lena finally spoke. I didn't know, she said, almost to herself. I didn't know who he was. Jenna replied softly. You didn't care to. Colin rubbed the back of his neck. This is bad, real bad. Noah sat down on the crew jump seat and ran both hands over his face. The flight had not even pushed back from the gate, and already the damage had been done. Outside, the sun moved higher in the sky. The gate agent in the terminal stared through the glass, confused by the delay. A second announcement came through the PA system. Cabin crew, pause all activity. Central Command will issue further instructions. Lena turned to Jenna. Do we still do the pre-flight checks? I don't think we're the ones in charge anymore, Jenna whispered. Darian's phone buzzed once. He didn't check it yet. Instead, he looked out the window again, watching a baggage crew slowly load the last of the cargo. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. For the first time in a while, he felt it. Not satisfaction, not revenge, clarity, and that was all he needed. The cabin of Flight 482 had gone quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was a silence charged with tension, like the pause before a sudden storm, the kind of silence that made passengers lower their voices without knowing why, that made flight attendants second-guess the next step, that made a man like Darian Wells lean back in his seat with his eyes open, not because he was tired, but because he was fully awake now. The radios hadn't chirped again. Not yet. But the weight of their last transmission hung in the air like smoke. FAA coordination. Observational protocol. Those words didn't just sting. They unsettled. In the front galley. Lena Brody leaned against the cold metal of the beverage cart. Her hands were shaking. She tried to steady herself by taking slow breaths, but the oxygen felt thin. Beside her, Colin Rourke muttered something she couldn't quite hear. Jenna Myers stood rigid with her back to them, staring through the curtain at the passengers, all of whom had now become observers. She could feel it, the pressure, the scrutiny, the 1,000 eyes that once looked past them now refusing to look away. "I thought we were doing the right thing," Lena whispered. Colin scoffed. "You thought wrong. Jenna didn't turn around. You just didn't want him in that seat." Lena turned to her. "What is that supposed to mean?" Jenna looked over her shoulder, voice cold. "You didn't question anyone else." Colin stepped between them. "Enough. This isn't the time." From the aisle, Noah Tran approached cautiously. His face was pale, and his hand still trembled slightly from the interaction. He held the crew tablet tightly, eyes scanning the latest updates. He didn't look at any of them directly. "They're watching everything now," he said quietly. "We're being logged. Each word, every movement." Lena's stomach turned. Colin shook his head. Why didn't the system flag him earlier? Why now? Because he was flying under discretion clearance. Noah replied, "We weren't supposed to know." Micah Thompson sat in row 4, his phone still raised, though his expression had shifted. He wasn't grinning anymore. His stream had grown into the tens of thousands, but he wasn't just feeding content now. He was documenting. People were commenting in real time. "He's FAA. This is unreal. Watch the blonde woman. She's freaking out. They tried to remove him without even checking his ID. Tell him thank you." Micah stared into the lens and spoke, his voice soft but clear. This guy didn't yell, didn't threaten. He just sat, and somehow the entire flight is upside down now. Back in seat 2A. Darian shifted his gaze toward the curtain. He could hear them back there. Whispers, shuffling, the sound of someone pacing, the quiet curse from someone who thought they were alone. He didn't need to eavesdrop. He already knew what they were saying. That's the part they never understood. He wasn't listening for words. He was listening for change. The curtain pulled back. Lena appeared again, but this time she didn't come alone. Trailing behind her was a senior operations officer in a gray Skylark vest and a secondary FAA security liaison in a dark navy blazer. Their presence was unmistakable, official, measured, serious. The officer stepped forward. "Mr. Wells," she began, her tone respectful. "I apologize again for the inconvenience. We've confirmed your clearance and your seat assignment. You may remain where you are without further question." Darian nodded once. The FAA liaison turned to Lena, who visibly braced herself. "Ms. Brody, we've received a full copy of the interaction from cabin footage and 2 independent recordings. As of now, Skylark Operations is enacting a Zone 1 communication freeze. No further announcements or guest interactions will proceed without FAA approval." Lena nodded, stunned. "Understood," the liaison added. "That includes verbal escalation, seating verifications, and any staff-originated requests involving passenger 2A. Jenna stood frozen. Colin cursed under his breath again and looked away. Noah said nothing. The officer added, "Central Command will be taking over routing of crew instructions for the remainder of the flight." As they left, Lena stood there, hands at her sides. Her voice cracked. "I didn't know." Darian opened his eyes. "You didn't ask." The words weren't cruel. They weren't loud. They were simply true. Passengers shifted in their seats. A man in 3B leaned to his wife and whispered. She thought he didn't belong. She nodded slowly. He never even raised his voice. Micah, whose phone now buzzed with constant notifications, lowered it for a second. He looked at Darian. The man was still composed, but something in his eyes carried weight, a kind of weight that didn't come from pride or revenge. It came from tiredness, not the kind that sleep cured, the kind that built slowly after years of explaining yourself to people who didn't care to listen. Noah took a hesitant step forward. I'm sorry, he said to Darian. I should have double-checked. The system was glitchy. Darian regarded him, voice even. You followed the screen. Noah nodded. But sometimes, Darian added, the screen isn't enough. Noah looked down, ashamed, then walked back toward the galley. A few moments later, Lena returned again, this time without backup. She didn't speak to Darian. Instead, she looked around the cabin, then made a quiet announcement. We're pausing boarding temporarily due to an internal systems update. Please remain seated and continue to use airplane mode. It was the first time she had sounded unsure, and people noticed. No one heckled her, no one laughed, but no one clapped either. Jenna returned to her jump seat and sat down. Colin stood, arms crossed, staring at the back of Darian's seat. Noah placed the tablet on the counter and walked away, somewhere into the service corridor, and in that space of stillness, something unspoken passed through the cabin, a reckoning, not loud, but irreversible. Darian sat with his arms folded gently in front of him. His phone had vibrated again minutes ago. He still hadn't picked it up. He was waiting for the right moment. He always did. Because sometimes the loudest correction didn't come from speaking. It came from refusing to move. Darian Wells remained in his seat, unmoving. The calm he wore wasn't for show. It was armor, carefully built across years of having to be unshakable. He didn't bounce his foot, didn't shift in discomfort, but beneath the composed exterior, thoughts churned in quiet motion. He wasn't angry. He was tired of the performance. The long, exhausting performance of respectability where every word had to be perfectly measured, every gesture non-threatening, every truth delayed until it was palatable enough to be heard. What would have happened if he weren't FAA? He knew the answer. He had lived it before. Outside his window, the ramp crew continued loading luggage, oblivious to the storm that had passed through the cabin. The sunlight had turned sharper, slicing across the wing and onto the floor by his shoes. He looked down at the light as if considering it. Then, slowly, he picked up his phone. Micah Thompson's live stream had reached over 30,000 viewers. Micah wasn't trying to be famous. Not really. But something inside him told him this mattered. And that voice inside him, though young and inexperienced, was louder than the one telling him to play it safe. The stream had become a symbol, a mirror. Micah spoke directly into the lens. This isn't just about a seat. You get that, right? They tried to push him out without asking questions. They assumed, and if that badge hadn't come out, he let the sentence hang. Comments poured in. This is why we film. That man is grace under fire. She should be fired on the spot. Who is he really? Micah didn't know the full story yet, but he would soon. In the rear galley, a different kind of conversation was happening. A flight attendant named Tasha Miller, assigned to economy, had heard everything through the crew comms. She wasn't part of the first-class team, hadn't seen what Lena or Colin did, but she'd felt the shift, and now she stood just inside the galley doors, hands gripping the cart rail, jaw tight. She glanced at her crewmate, a rookie named James. "Did you hear that?" she asked. James nodded slowly. "They're saying the guy in 2A's some high-up FAA official, that the crew messed up." Tasha exhaled sharply. "No, they didn't mess up. They profiled him." James went quiet. "I've seen it before," Tasha said, her voice tight, 100 times. "A black man in first class, and suddenly it's, 'Can I see your ticket again? Sir, are you sure this is your seat?'" James said nothing. "I'm telling you right now, if that man didn't have power, they would have had security drag him out. That's what scares me the most. Back in first class." Jenna Myers sat rigid in her jump seat. Her head leaned against the window near the galley door, and her hands trembled just slightly. She kept seeing his face, Darian's, the calm, the way he never lost control, never raised his voice, never pushed back because he knew the world wouldn't let him. He had carried it all without flinching, and still, they had treated him like he didn't belong. Jenna had worked this route for 6 years. She'd seen tantrums in first class, angry hedge fund managers, loud celebrities, drunk tech founders. None of them got asked to verify a ticket twice. Only him. She felt shame blooming inside her chest. Lena was pacing the galley again. She looked toward Jenna. "They're going to report us, aren't they?" Jenna didn't answer. "They're going to write us up, maybe suspend us," Jenna whispered. "We deserve it." Lena's head snapped up. "Excuse me, you saw him," Jenna said. "You scanned his ticket. You escalated anyway. I followed protocol. No, you followed your fear." The silence between them was worse than any argument. Lena turned away, but the words stayed with her. Noah Tran returned with the tablet again, face pale, expression unreadable. He tapped the screen a few times. "FAA command just flagged the incident," he said. "They're pushing it to upper-level review." Colin groaned. "So, we're officially being investigated." Noah nodded. "And," he added, "they flagged Micah Thompson's live stream. It's viral." "What do you mean viral?" Noah turned the screen so they could see. The video was now being shared on major media platforms. Several journalists had already commented on the situation, using terms like racial profiling, institutional abuse, and first-class confrontation. Darian Wells's face calm, composed, silent was everywhere. Colin turned away and swore under his breath. Lena stared at the screen like it had betrayed her, but it hadn't. It had simply told the truth. Back in 2A, Darian finally opened his email. Dozens of new messages had come in from FAA oversight staff, 2 from the media, 1 from the chairwoman herself, Elaine Torres. Her subject line read, "We move forward now. On your call." He closed the email without reading the body. He wasn't ready yet. He needed a few more moments of quiet, of remembering, because the weight of the silence he had carried wasn't just for today. It was for every time someone like him had been told to prove they belonged. He didn't need to go public. He didn't need revenge, but he needed justice. And this time, the world was watching. Micah's stream paused for a moment, then came back. He lowered the camera and whispered, "I think he's about to speak." But Darian didn't. Not yet. He turned his head toward the window again. A little girl from Coach had walked past during the delay to use the front lavatory. She had brown skin, 2 pigtails, and big eyes. Her mother followed closely, apologizing to the crew for passing through first class. As the girl walked back, She slowed near Darian's seat. She looked at him quietly. He looked back and offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. She smiled back. It was the first warm thing that had happened on the flight since boarding began. The girl returned to her seat. Her mother mouthed thank you. Darian said nothing. But something inside him, something deep, began to move. A shift, not in his posture, in his purpose. Because this wasn't just a seat anymore. It was a story, and it was his to tell. The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft prepared for pushback. Though the boarding delay had left more than time suspended in the air, the atmosphere in first class was no longer simply tense. It had become electric, charged with awareness, judgment, and an unfamiliar edge of truth. Darian Wells sat in 2A, still as ever. But something had changed in the way people looked at him now. It wasn't suspicion, it was recognition, not just of who he was, but what he stood for. Across the aisle, a man in a business suit, mid-40s, leaned over and said softly, "I saw everything. Just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Darian offered a small nod, nothing more. The man wasn't looking for a response, just to say it, because silence, too, had its price. Micah Thompson's live stream had now crossed 80,000 live viewers. News outlets were embedding the video. Hashtags had begun to trend. But it wasn't just Darian's presence that was drawing attention. It was his restraint. That was the part that struck people most. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't barked orders, hadn't used his title to cut through the system like a sword. He had waited, letting others reveal themselves. Back in the galley. Lena Brody refreshed the crew manifest on the tablet for the 10th time. The name Darian Wells now appeared in bold under Seat 2A, marked with an FAA oversight badge icon and an advisory tag protected clearance, limited staff interaction. It was like the system had always known, but they hadn't. Or worse, they hadn't bothered to ask. Colin Rourke stood stiffly by the service entrance, his radio silent now. For once, he had no comment, no smug reaction, just a quiet stare toward the front of the plane. Jenna Myers had excused herself to the lavatory 10 minutes ago and hadn't returned. Noah Tran sat in the crew seat, knees bouncing, trying not to look like he was coming apart. Then, without warning, the curtain shifted again. A tall man entered, thin-framed glasses, trim charcoal blazer, neutral expression. At his side, a woman with a briefcase, hair pinned back in a no-nonsense twist. They weren't part of the crew. They weren't airline staff. And they weren't asking for directions. FAA Audit Division, the man said quietly, flashing his ID to the nearest flight attendant. He didn't raise his voice, but every head in the first class turned toward him. He walked directly to Lena, who had just stepped out of the galley. "You're the lead," she nodded stiffly. "Yes." He didn't offer his name yet. "Protocol requires we interview involved crew members while the aircraft remains grounded. This isn't disciplinary yet. It's procedural." Lena looked toward Colin, then back to the auditor. "Now, yes, now." Colin approached slowly, brows furrowed. "We haven't even taken off." The woman beside the auditor replied flatly, "That's why we're here. Once airborne, escalation becomes safety critical. Our oversight starts here." Jenna returned just in time to see them speaking. Her face paled instantly. The male auditor turned to Darian and gave a nod not of familiarity, but of respect. Darian nodded back. It was understood. No performance necessary. The passengers around them pretended not to listen, but their posture betrayed them. Leaning forward, tilting heads subtly, phones lowered, not for respect but for better hearing. Micah didn't lower his phone at all. The camera kept rolling. The male auditor gestured toward the front galley. Crew first. Passenger input comes after. Darian leaned back again. He wasn't going anywhere. Lena followed them reluctantly. Colin trailed behind, face tense. Jenna hesitated, then followed. Noah didn't move. He wasn't asked. Instead, he looked across the aisle and locked eyes with Darian. And, for the first time, Darian saw something in the young man's expression that felt honest. Regret, not performative, not for show, real. Noah stood, walked over, and crouched near the seat. "I should have said something sooner," he said quietly. "I knew something felt wrong, but I just froze." Darian considered him for a moment. Sometimes, he said, silence protects your job. Noah nodded, ashamed, but sometimes, Darian continued, it cost someone else theirs. He didn't say it cruelly. He didn't need to. Noah blinked hard, nodded once, and returned to his seat. Inside the forward galley, the FAA audit team questioned the crew one by one, Lena first. Her voice trembled slightly. "I scanned his ticket. It didn't register. I followed protocol. Did you ask for a second scan? No. Did you ask his name before escalating? No. I assumed the scanner was correct." Why, she paused. "I didn't think someone like him." She stopped herself. The auditor waited. Lena swallowed. "I didn't think he was supposed to be there, because he didn't look like the usual passengers in first." Silence. The female auditor typed notes quickly. The sound of the keys was like a ticking clock. They moved to Colin next. I supported the lead. He said, arms crossed. "Did you verify the manifest independently? No. Did you check the system logs for delay and updates? No. Did the passenger raise his voice or make threats? No. What prompted the radio call to escalate? He was filming. For how long? A few seconds, and you deem that a security concern." Colin's silence was answer enough. Then Jenna. She was calmer and more honest. "I followed orders. I knew something didn't feel right, but I didn't push back. That's on me." The male auditor studied her. Why didn't it feel right? Because he was calm, completely calm, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing, like someone who had been through it before. The woman stopped typing, and that made you uncomfortable. Jenna nodded slowly. "Yes, because I realized I had." The auditors paused, then thanked them. Outside, passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered. Some remained silent, but no one in first class dared question anything now, because the moment had already happened. The story was already out, and everyone could see how fragile truth looked when it stood alone until someone with quiet power refused to move. Darian sat in 2A, eyes closed once more, but this time, behind his calm, he felt something different. Not fatigue, not pain, conviction, and that was far more dangerous to injustice than anger ever was. The cabin was quieter now, not with tension, but with anticipation. Something had shifted. The crew had been pulled into the galley one by one. The FAA auditors had done their rounds. Whispers flowed down the aisle like currents under a still lake. Everyone knew something was coming, but no one knew when or who would trigger it. In 2A, Darian Wells sat upright now. The calm was still there, but it was no longer armor. It was intention. His phone rested in his hand, still untouched from earlier. Dozens of missed calls, messages from public relations, federal contacts, even the FAA chairwoman herself, Elaine Torres. They were all waiting for him to act, to respond, to take control. He had the power now, but power wasn't what drove him. Not today. Across the aisle, a woman in a navy pantsuit leaned in. "Sir, I just wanted to say what they did, what they tried to do. I'm sorry. I've seen it happen before. Not always this visible, but always the same pattern." Darian met her eyes. She meant it. She wasn't apologizing as a passenger. She was apologizing as a witness. And that was different. He nodded gently. "Thank you." Behind him, another voice piped up, a man in his 60s. White hair, expensive watch. "You handled that with more grace than I think I could have managed." Darian turned his head slightly. "You could have managed. The question is, would they have treated you the same?" The man opened his mouth, closed it again, then nodded. Slowly, Micah Thompson, still filming quietly from row 4, whispered into the live stream again. "He hasn't said much, but it's like the whole plane is waiting for his next move." His comments had become a flood. Does he work for the government FAA executive? His name is out now. He's trending. Zone 1, reckoning is the hashtag. This man is calm power. We're witnessing something historic. Then the PA system beeped. Everyone paused. The voice that came through wasn't the usual sterile announcement tone. It was calm, direct, and unfamiliar to most of the crew. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Victor Haynes, lead auditor with the FAA Internal Affairs Oversight Division. We appreciate your patience. This flight has undergone an emergency delay to allow compliance review due to multiple protocol violations during boarding." Passengers turned toward one another. This delay is not due to weather, technical malfunction, or staffing error. It is the result of procedural bias and failure to confirm elevated passenger clearance. A low gasp moved through the cabin. To be transparent, one of our senior FAA executives was improperly challenged, scanned twice, and obstructed from taking his assigned seat based on flawed assumptions made by crew. Those involved have been placed under review. An external investigation is now underway. You could have heard a pin drop. The voice continued. This is not about a single incident. This is about setting a precedent that silent professionalism is not weakness, that respect is not conditional, that discrimination, whether through words, action, or omission, will not go unnoticed. Micah looked around. He's talking about him, about Darian Wells, and then, as if by design, the curtain to the front cabin opened again. Victor Haynes himself stepped into the aisle. Behind him stood Lena Brody, pale and shaken. Behind her, FAA security personnel. Further back, a gate agent held a phone to her ear, nodding silently, then lowering the device and pointing toward 2A. Victor's voice was now no longer over the intercom. He spoke directly to Darian. "Mr. Wells, would you care to say a few words?" Darian stood slowly. He didn't raise his hands, didn't clear his throat. He simply stepped forward, facing the first-class passengers, the crew, and the rows beyond the curtain who leaned silently toward the sound. His voice was steady, measured. "My name is Darian Wells. I'm an executive officer for the Federal Aviation Administration. I oversee policy integrity, safety compliance, and escalation protocols across multiple carriers. There were no gasps, just silence and focus. This morning, I boarded as usual, calm, respectful, on time. And yet I was met with hesitation, not because of my documentation, not because of my behavior, but because of something more subtle. He paused. Then, assumption, a ripple of emotion stirred through the seats. I didn't come here to expose anyone. I didn't come here with a camera crew or a press release. I came here as a citizen, as someone doing their job, and yet I was treated as if I didn't belong. His eyes moved toward the galley where Lena stood frozen. I've spent a career teaching others that aviation is about systems, structure, safety, but systems are only as good as the people running them. And people carry bias. He turned toward the rows behind the curtain. How many others, he said louder now, have been removed, silenced, or humiliated without a title to protect them? The silence was no longer quiet. It was charged with shame, with understanding. This isn't about me. This is about what happens when we assume silence equals submission, when we confuse restraint with weakness. He glanced at Micah, then nodded once. Micah, stunned, lowered the phone. I remained seated today not because I lacked options, but because I wanted every single person on this plane to see what dignity under pressure looks like. He let the words breathe. And because next time, it might not be me. Darian stepped back, calm as ever. Victor Haynes nodded in gratitude. The passengers began to clap. Not polite applause, not pity, but recognition. Even Colin, standing by the wall, lowered his head slightly. Jenna Myers wiped her cheek. Noah sat motionless, a mix of awe and regret on his face. Lena, she simply turned, walked quietly back into the galley, and closed the curtain behind her. Darian returned to his seat. This time, no one questioned if he belonged there. No one dared. 30,000 feet above the ground. Flight 482 was finally in the air. But no one on board felt like they were flying. Not really. The aircraft cruised smoothly toward Chicago, but tension still held the cabin in its grip, not the nervous kind that makes people clutch armrests, but the contemplative kind that makes them reflect. It was the silence of consequence. Micah Thompson sat upright in row 4. His live stream paused at last, not because interest had faded, but because his battery had died. Even then, people were now uploading clips, quoting Darian's words, dissecting every frame. Twitter was exploding. News outlets had scrambled to identify the FAA official in seat 2A. They had, and now, the headlines read like a reckoning. Black FAA executive silenced in first class, then silences the room zone. One showdown exposes airline bias. The man who didn't need to raise his voice. Darian Wells sat calmly, reading nothing. He didn't need to. He had felt the shift in the air the moment the plane left the tarmac. People had looked at him differently, not as a curiosity or a threat, but as a reminder, a mirror, and that was more powerful than anger. The crew, meanwhile, was unraveling. In the front galley, Lena Brody leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the sink, trying not to cry. Every movement now felt heavier, like she was being watched, because she was, not just by the passengers, but by her own memory of what she had done. Jenna Myers approached her quietly. "You okay?" Lena didn't answer. She stared at her reflection in the brushed steel wall. "He didn't humiliate me," Lena said softly. "He didn't even say my name." Jenna nodded. That's what hurt the most. Colin Rourke stood a few feet away, arms folded. He hadn't spoken since Darian's speech. His face was hard, unreadable, but even he wasn't arrogant enough to deny what had just unfolded. "He didn't have to say your name," Jenna added. "We all know who he meant." Lena turned to her. "I thought I was being thorough. I thought I was following protocol." Jenna didn't reply. She just shook her head and stepped away. A chime sounded on the crew tablet. Lena picked it up instinctively, needing a distraction. But what she read stopped her cold. Private message from Jonathan Reese. Subject: executive review commencing. "Who's that?" Jenna asked. Lena blinked. "Jonathan Reese. He's our executive VP of operations." Jenna leaned in. "What does it say?" Lena read the message aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "To all crew involved in the events on Flight 482, we are currently reviewing all internal communications, body cam footage, and system interactions. We are also in contact with FAA Chairwoman Elaine Torres. You are advised not to speak to the press. Internal statements will be collected upon arrival. We expect full cooperation." Jenna exhaled. "So, that's it? We're under investigation?" "No," Lena murmured. "We're under a microscope." Colin finally spoke. "We were just doing our jobs." Jenna spun around. Where we, Colin, held his ground. "You think this is only about him? We follow systems. If the scanner didn't verify, it's not the scanner that made you doubt him." Jenna snapped. "It was you. The way you looked at him. Like he didn't belong. He didn't reply." Noah Tran, sitting silently near the jump seat, glanced up. "They're going to fire someone for this." The words hung in the air. Meanwhile, at the very back of the aircraft, Tasha Miller, the economy crew member, opened her own tablet to scan feedback from coach passengers. What she found was startling. Nearly a dozen messages had been submitted through the in-flight app. Anonymous, polite, but clear. "I witnessed inappropriate handling of a black passenger during boarding. The gentleman in 2A was mistreated. The crew was out of line. This isn't the airline I trust." Tasha frowned. She knew the truth. She'd seen it happen on flights before, discreet prejudice hiding behind policy. But this time, the target wasn't defenseless. He had power, and he had the world's attention. She made a decision. She tapped open her crew report form, and she started writing. Meanwhile, in 2A, Darian finally opened the email from FAA Chairwoman Elaine Torres. "Darian, you've made more impact in the last hour than we've achieved in months of internal briefings. I've spoken with Reese personally. The airline will cooperate. I know you didn't want a spotlight, but sometimes it finds you for a reason. When you land, we'll need to speak, and soon. Elaine." He read it once, then again. He closed it without replying. He wasn't ready to speak again yet. He needed to finish the flight first, to sit through what remained. Not because he was trapped, but because he believed in seeing things through, behind him. Micah tapped his shoulder gently. "Hey, sorry to bother you," but Darian turned. Micah held out his phone. It was charging again. Screen lit up. "Would you want to say something to the people watching? They're still here. Thousands. They want to know what happens next." Darian looked at the phone, then back at Micah. He considered it, then said, "What happens next is the part that matters most." Micah blinked. "You mean when we land, no?" Darian said quietly. "I mean what people do when no one's filming." Micah's hand dropped slightly. "Wow." Darian gave him a small nod. "You did the right thing today. Just remember the camera doesn't give you truth, it gives you reach. You still have to live the truth when the battery dies." Micah's eyes widened. He wasn't used to wisdom that hit that hard. He didn't say anything else, just nodded and turned back around, thinking. Darian leaned back once more, and this time he finally exhaled, not from relief, but from resolve. He had spoken, the world had listened. Now came the hardest part, waiting to see who would act on what they heard. Flight 482 touched down on the Chicago runway just after 3:47 p.m. The wheels met the tarmac with a low rumble. But the touchdown didn't spark the usual light applause or nervous chatter. It was quiet, reflective, like everyone aboard knew this arrival was not just about geography. They had crossed into a different kind of territory. Jenna Myers stared out the window as the flaps lifted, her reflection in the glass pale and unreadable. She hadn't spoken to Lena again since the message from corporate. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She was still processing the moment Darian stood up and used the very thing they'd tried to strip from him, his voice. Colin Rourke remained seated at the front jump seat, arms folded, eyes closed, but he wasn't resting. He was calculating. He had read the temperature in the cabin shift like a weather map, and this wasn't going to blow over. Noah Tran stood behind the curtain, tablet in hand, refreshing it every 10 seconds. Corporate had locked certain crew access functions. That had never happened before. It wasn't just a flag, it was a red alert. Lena Brody stood at the galley's edge, hands behind her back. Her nails dug into her palm. She had practiced 1,000 variations of her apology since Darian's speech. None of them sounded right. None of them felt earned. She didn't want forgiveness. She wanted to understand how she'd ended up on the wrong side of a story she thought she'd never be part of. The intercom chimed. Flight attendants, prepare for arrival. Passengers began to stir, seat belts clicked. Overhead, bins opened with soft thuds. Darian Wells didn't move yet. He waited. It wasn't hesitation, it was patience. The kind earned from decades of watching the world misjudge him and having to outlast it. Micah Thompson packed up his equipment slowly. His live stream had reached over 1.3 million views before the feed was archived. He had 4 major news outlets waiting in his DMs, but his eyes weren't on his phone. They were on Darian, watching how a man with every reason to be furious still wore peace like a tailored coat. As passengers began to deplane, one elderly black woman, seat 3B, stopped beside Darian. She smiled. "You made us proud today, baby." Darian looked up, surprised. She didn't linger for a response, just placed a gentle hand on his shoulder for a moment, then walked down the aisle and disappeared into the jet bridge. The line continued, businessmen with brief nods, younger passengers with long glances, quiet acknowledgement. Nobody wanted to be the person who ignored what had happened. Not anymore. When it was Micah's turn to exit, he hesitated. Darian gave him a single nod. "You did what mattered," he said quietly. Micah blinked, then whispered, "So did you." As Micah stepped off the plane, he paused in the bridge and pulled out his phone. He looked into the lens. For those asking what happened next, he didn't demand anything. He didn't shout. He waited. And when he stood up, the whole flight leaned in. He hit send. The message was already going viral. Back in the aircraft, the FAA audit team had returned. Victor Haynes stood just inside the cabin with his assistant. He approached the crew one last time. "Final debrief will happen tomorrow morning," he said. "Until then, You are all suspended from active duty pending review. No uniform, no flights. Statements will be collected at 9 a.m. sharp," Colin muttered under his breath. "This is ridiculous." Victor turned to him calmly. "Is it?" Colin looked away. Victor continued down the line. "You'll be escorted through a separate gate. This is protocol for high-profile oversight cases. Don't speak to press. Don't post online." He glanced toward Lena last. She looked at him directly. "Will we be allowed to explain?" He nodded once, but not justify. They filed out through the crew exit, heads down. Only Jenna turned back and looked toward Darian one last time. He didn't meet her eyes, but he didn't look away either. Minutes later, when the last passenger was gone, Darian rose from his seat. He stepped off the aircraft like any other traveler, calm, composed, briefcase in hand, no escort, no flashing lights, but he wasn't alone. Standing at the end of the jet bridge was a woman in her early 60s. Gray curls tucked under a wide-brimmed navy hat, soft almond brown skin, pearl earrings. Her name was Darian Wells, his mother. Darian saw her and paused. His face didn't break, but something in his eyes softened. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. She held him like he was 10 years old again. And, for a moment, Darian didn't have to be strong, didn't have to be composed. He just let himself be held. "I saw the stream," she whispered. "I saw what they tried to do." He said nothing. "You didn't lose your temper. No. You didn't call them out. No. But you made them look at themselves." He closed his eyes. "That's the part they'll never forget," she said. They stayed there like that for a long moment. Finally, she stepped back and looked at him. "You ready for what comes next?" Darian didn't answer right away, but the look in his eyes said yes. Together, they walked toward the baggage claim. Behind them, a gate agent hung a temporary sign near the counter. It read, "Flight 482 under investigation. Public statement pending." The storm had landed, and it was just beginning. The FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C. was designed to feel neutral. Glass walls, neutral gray carpet, polished steel nameplates. But today, neutrality had no place in the room. Darian Wells sat at the long oval conference table near the window, his hands calmly folded in front of him. Beside him sat Elaine Torres, chairwoman of the FAA, poised, direct, and unmistakably in control. Across from them were 4 individuals from the agency's legal and public affairs divisions, and 2 men from Skyspan Air's executive leadership, one of whom was Jonathan Reese, VP of Operations, flanked by his legal counsel. There was no smile, no handshake, just tension so thick you could measure it in inches. Elaine opened the meeting with the tone of someone not interested in wasting a second. "We are here today because Flight 482 wasn't just a flight. It became a mirror." No one spoke. She nodded toward Darian. "The man sitting here did not break protocol. He did not escalate. He did not record, leak, or publicize anything. The public did that for him." Jonathan cleared his throat. "We understand the intensity of the reaction, and we regret the emotional toll this placed on Mr. Wells. We are actively working on a training package." Elaine raised one hand. "No." Jonathan blinked. "No more training packages. No corporate statements about diversity commitments or unconscious bias modules. This isn't a PR problem. This is a cultural one." The silence was heavy. Elaine looked to Darian. "Would you like to speak now?" Darian looked across the table slowly. He didn't posture. He didn't raise his voice, but every word landed like a gavel. I'm not here for an apology. I've seen enough of those on TV, in emails, in HR paperwork. What I haven't seen is accountability. Reese leaned forward. We suspended the crew involved. We launched an internal review within hours. Darian held his gaze. You suspended people after a video went viral. Would you have acted if no one was watching? Jonathan hesitated. That was the answer. Darian continued, voice calm. I've been traveling for 20 years. I've been pulled aside, questioned, scanned twice. It's never on paper, but it's always there. This time, I had a title that protected me. Most don't. He paused, letting that sit. So, let's stop pretending this is about a single flight. This is about every quiet injustice that didn't get caught on camera. Elaine nodded with subtle pride. One of the FAA legal reps cleared her throat. From a procedural standpoint, we must consider how to handle Mr. Wells' public visibility going forward. There's concern he's now a polarizing figure. Darian turned to her. I didn't choose visibility. I chose silence until it stopped working. The room stilled. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. We're receiving shareholder pressure, sponsorship concerns. One of our international partners asked if Mr. Wells will be involved in future compliance reviews. Elaine spoke before Darian could. If you're implying retaliation, Jonathan, I'd advise you to stop right now. Jonathan held up his hands. I'm just saying, this has gone global. Darian gave a small, dry smile. That's the problem. It had to go global to be taken seriously. A long pause. Then Elaine stood. We're going to issue a joint directive. FAA and Skyspan. Mandatory accountability oversight for all flight crews. Every manifest system will now include escalation tags for senior FAA personnel, and you will train your staff to recognize them. Jonathan nodded slowly. Elaine added, and we're creating a new office with an FAA Passenger Rights and Equity Division. Darian will lead it. Everyone at the table blinked. Even Darian. Elaine looked at him gently. You didn't ask for it, but you earned it. Darian stayed quiet for a beat, then nodded. I'll do it, but not for PR, for prevention. Elaine smiled faintly. That's the only kind of leadership I trust. The meeting ended without celebration, just quiet acknowledgement. Outside the room, the waiting area buzzed with reporters behind ropes and flashing lights. Darian slipped out a side door, avoiding the cameras, but even in shadow, he knew the story was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever sat in silence, hoping the system would speak up for them. Meanwhile, back at Skyspan Air's headquarters, a very different meeting was taking place. The marketing team huddled in a glass office, reviewing their new campaign titled Everyone Belong, posters, stock images, a planned video montage of diverse staff smiling beside airplanes. Their head of communications, Clara Whitmore, tapped her pen nervously. Should we pull the campaign? The creative director shook his head. It's too far along, and it fits. Clara frowned, but does it feel sincere? After what just happened, the room fell silent. Then someone else added, we should have made it fit before the incident. Now it looks reactive. Clara picked up her phone. She stared at her inbox, filled with press inquiries. A new email had just come in from someone anonymous. It had no subject, just one sentence until you face the mirror. Don't buy a new frame. She closed her eyes and sighed. Back in Chicago, Darian returned home late that evening. The apartment was modest, filled with books and warm lighting. His mother, Darian Wells, sat on the couch with a mug of tea. "You were all over the news again," she said softly. Darian sank into the armchair beside her. "I didn't ask for any of this. I know, but I can't walk away from it now." "No," she agreed. "You can't." He looked down at his hands. "They want me to lead something new, something big." Marion nodded. "You always led, baby. You just did it quietly. Now the world's listening." Darian smiled faintly. "Quiet doesn't mean invisible." "No," she said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Quiet means strong." They sat in the stillness for a while. No screens, no alerts, no noise, just the shared understanding of what it meant to speak when others wouldn't, and what it cost to do so. The morning air was cool in Chicago, crisp with the first signs of fall. Outside a small charter school on the south side, students filed into their classrooms clutching tablets and notebooks, chatting about math tests, homecoming, and trending videos. Inside room 207 Ms. Carter, a high school civics teacher in her 30s, stood before her first period class with a projector screen behind her. A paused video. The thumbnail showed a calm, tall black man standing in the aisle of an airplane cabin. Eyes focused, shoulders squared, mouth mid-sentence. The caption read, "Zone 1 change today." She turned to her class. "This is Darian Wells." She began, "Executive with the FAA. This week, something happened to him on a flight that made the world look twice." A hand shot up from the front row. "Is this the guy who got racially profiled and then ended up fixing the airline rules, Ms.?" Carter smiled. "More than that. He stayed calm. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He made them see what they didn't want to admit." Another student raised her voice from the back. "So he went viral just by staying quiet." "No." "Ms.," Carter said softly, "he went viral for showing what dignity looks like when no one expects you to hold it." The room was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, she hit play. The students watched. They didn't speak. They leaned forward as Darian's voice filled the classroom, narrating his experience in calm, measured words. Their expressions changed from curiosity to empathy to awe. When the clip ended, Miss Carter turned off the projector. "Your assignment," she said, "is to write a one-page reflection on how power can be quiet, and how silence, when chosen, can be a form of protest." One boy in the middle row raised his hand slowly. "Do you think he knew we'd all be watching him, Ms.?" Carter smiled again. "I think he hoped someone would finally listen." Elsewhere, in a quiet apartment on the edge of downtown, Jenna Myers sat on her couch with her laptop open. Her flight attendant ID badge lay beside her, face down. She hadn't worn it in 4 days. The airline had offered her a choice immediate reassignment pending investigation, or voluntary leave without pay. She chose silence, but now she was ready to say something, not to a lawyer, not to a supervisor, to Darian. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed, "Mr. Wells, you probably don't remember me. I was part of the crew on Flight 482. I wasn't the one who stopped you. I wasn't the one who made the call, but I also wasn't the one who spoke up. And that's what I've been sitting with. The way you stood up, not physically, but morally, has kept me up every night since. I keep replaying that moment. You didn't have to explain anything, but you did. Not for you. For us. I just want to say I see you now, and I'm sorry for not seeing you sooner." She hesitated, then added, "If you're ever willing to talk, even for 5 minutes, I'd like to listen." She hit send, then she closed the laptop and sat back. For the first time in days, she breathed, back in D.C. Darian stood outside a small community center not far from FAA headquarters. He had received an invitation from the school board to attend a youth event inspired by aviation careers. He hadn't planned to accept, but then he'd seen the handwritten note attached. "You made my students feel seen. They want to thank you themselves. Ms. Carter." He stepped inside the gym. What he saw brought him to a halt. Rows of students wearing name tags that read Future Pilot, Future Engineer, Future FAA Agent. A large paper banner hung overhead. "Flight 482 changed our course." As soon as he entered, one student spotted him and gasped, "It's him." The room turned, a burst of applause, then silence, and then cheering. "Ms." Carter approached with a wide grin. "They've been rehearsing for days. They wanted to perform a short skit based on what happened." Darian raised an eyebrow. "A skit." She nodded. "It's called Zone 1. It's only 5 minutes, but it's powerful." He sat down. The lights dimmed. A group of students stepped forward, reenacting the scene. A mock cabin, a makeshift crew, a young black boy seated in 2A, holding a prop briefcase. Another student, playing a flight attendant, hesitates, unsure whether to believe him. The scene shifts. Another student reads lines from Darian's real speech, word for word. "I remained seated today, not because I lacked options, but because I wanted every single person to see what dignity under pressure looks like." The lights rise. Darian stood, stunned. The students bowed. He clapped, slowly, then faster. Then the whole room joined him. Afterward, one student, probably no older than 12, approached him with a sketchbook. "I drew this," the girl said. It was a pencil drawing of him sitting in 2A, calm, composed, with a faint, determined light behind him. He knelt down. "What's your name, Layla?" she said. "Layla. This is incredible." She bit her lip. "I want to be someone like you when I grow up." He looked at the drawing again, then handed it back to her. "No," he said. "Be someone like you." That evening, Darian returned home to find a voicemail waiting. It was from Jenna Myers. He listened. Her voice cracked once, but it was honest, clear. He didn't delete the message. He didn't return it. Not yet, but he saved it. Because maybe, just maybe, the next conversation wasn't about what had happened, but what came after. The rotunda at the Hart Senate office building was crowded beyond capacity. Rows of reporters stood shoulder to shoulder in the back. Cameras craned toward the long mahogany table. A dozen senators sat in front, their nameplates sharp beneath the lighting. Alongside them, union leaders, airline CEOs, civil rights attorneys, and FAA representatives. And at the center of it all, sitting with a straight back and a composed expression, was Darian Wells. No title cards, no flashing banner, just his name and a microphone. The room quieted as the chairwoman tapped her gavel. "We now call Mr. Darian Wells to provide formal testimony." He nodded once, adjusted the mic, and took a breath. "My name is Darian Wells. I've worked with the Federal Aviation Administration for 14 years. Before that, I served in the Air Force. My job has always been about keeping people safe, seen or unseen, Most days, I didn't need thanks, just trust. He glanced up, making eye contact with several senators. Last week, I boarded Flight 482 to Chicago. I was scheduled to conduct a routine audit. I had a valid seat, an approved manifest, and the authority of my office behind me. But what I didn't carry, what I could never carry, was the benefit of doubt. There was no noise in the chamber, only the sound of honesty. I was stopped, questioned, doubted, not because of paperwork, but because of profile. Because somewhere in the minds of those greeting me that morning, I didn't look like someone who belonged in seat 2A. He paused. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't film. I didn't name names, but I did speak. He adjusted in his seat, and because that moment was recorded and broadcasted, now we're all here, and you're asking me what I want. He looked down for a second, then up again. I don't want punishment. I want reform, a rustle in the room. I want every airline to review its internal flagging systems for bias triggers. I want flight attendants trained not just to check credentials, but to check assumptions. I want airports to be places of transit, not trauma. He let the words linger. I want people, especially those who look like me, to stop carrying the burden of proving they belong in the spaces they've already earned. One of the senators leaned forward. Mr. Wells, do you believe this is systemic? Darian's gaze was steady. I believe what happened to me wasn't an error. It was an echo. That hit hard. The chairwoman tapped her pen against her notes but said nothing. Darian continued. There are thousands of people who don't get to speak into a microphone, who endure moments like mine without a title to protect them. They don't get articles or trending hashtags. They just get quiet hurt. He leaned forward slightly. So I'm asking you not to fix this for me. Fix it for the passengers who will never be invited into this room. Silence stretched long and meaningful. One of the reporters in the back quietly wiped her eyes. The chairwoman cleared her throat. Mr. Wells, the committee thanks you. Your testimony will be entered into the official record. He nodded, and just like that, it was done. The moment millions had waited for had passed, but what remained was more powerful than any applause. It was understanding. Outside the building, reporters swarmed the marble steps, but Darian didn't walk down them. He exited quietly through a side door, slipping into the morning light unnoticed. Waiting there, by the sidewalk, was Micah Thompson. Camera bag slung over his shoulder, his face shaded beneath a hoodie, but unmistakable. He stepped forward with a nervous grin. I wasn't trying to be dramatic, Micah said. I just wanted to thank you in person. Darian smiled softly. I should be thanking you. You gave truth a microphone. Micah chuckled. You didn't need one. You were louder than any camera. A moment passed. Micah looked around, then pulled something from his bag, a printed photo. It was the moment Darian had stood in the aisle on the flight, a still frame from the live stream. Behind him, every face turned toward him, listening, learning. Micah handed it over. I thought you should have this. Darian looked down at the image. It wasn't perfect, a little grainy, but it was real. He took it gently. Thank you. Also, Micah added awkwardly, I'm going back to school. Journalism, real journalism, no more just going viral. Darian gave him a nod. Tell the stories that matter, and tell them well. Micah grinned. Yes, sir. And just like that, he walked off into the city. Later that week, a new sign appeared at O'Hare International Airport. It read FAA Equity Oversight Office, Darian Wells. Director right beneath it. In smaller script, dignity is not given. It is recognized. That same evening, Darian returned to the home he had shared with his late father. Marion Wells was waiting, standing on the porch with 2 mugs of tea in her hands. He took one, sat down beside her, and sighed. "You did good, son," she said. "I didn't fix everything." He replied, "You didn't have to." They sat in silence. Then she said, "You remember what your father always told you when people underestimated you?" Darian nodded. "Don't raise your voice. Raise the standard." He looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the Chicago sky, and he smiled. A month later, Lena Brody returned to the skies, not with the same airline, not even in the same uniform. She joined a regional carrier with new leadership and was undergoing equity-based reorientation training created in part by Darian's new office. She hadn't spoken to him again, but every time she saw a passenger sit in first class, confident and quiet, she remembered his face and her own silence. The last scene wasn't a press conference or a news headline. It was a boy barely 7 years old walking through an airport holding his mother's hand. They passed a framed photo on the wall of a black man seated in 2A, surrounded by people listening. The caption read, "Darian Wells, the man who sat down. So we could all stand up." The boy tugged on his mom's hand. "Who is he?" She smiled. "He's someone who changed the rules without breaking anything." And they kept walking, toward their gate, toward something better. Darian Wells never asked for the spotlight. He didn't choose to become a symbol. But when they questioned his right to sit, he showed the world what it means to stand. Not with anger, not with blame, but with presence, with truth. Through his quiet resistance, he exposed a system too comfortable with silence and too slow to see its own reflection. And in doing so, he gave a voice to millions who never got the chance to speak. Let this story remind us. Respect should never be optional. Dignity should never be denied. And assumptions, especially the ones we don't say out loud, can be just as damaging as actions. We hope this journey stirred something in you. Not just sympathy, but awareness. Not just anger, but action. Because the next Darian Wells might be sitting in 2A, 10C, or right beside you, and how we choose to see them could change everything. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Together, let's keep these conversations in the air until they finally land where they belong.